Support your local Antifa. Eat the rich. Feminist action. Abolish ICE. These aren't just random empty slogans we hear chanted by Antifa. These were the actual phrases written on a bomb detonated outside Alabama Attorney General Steve Marshall's office in February 2024. Steve Marshall has been on the front lines, fighting against the radical left and their relentless attempts to destroy not just American families, but our children and their innocence. What is it about the modern American culture war that inspires so much violence from the left? You don't see conservatives shooting up schools over corporate tax cuts. We're witnessing an unprecedented wave of violence against those who stand up to the forces that quite literally seek to sterilize and mutilate children. And it's not just Charlie Kirk. He was only the latest target. There were Christian kids at Mass in Minnesota, and before that, Christian students in Nashville. Before that, a series of shootings committed by individuals claiming to be transgender all across the country. Is this simply the natural evolution of politics, or is it something far more nefarious? How do we get out of this disaster? Can America still be saved? I believe it can, and I believe it should, but I don't pretend to have all the answers. One thing is certain. The answers won't come from leaders in the Democratic Party who seem hell-bent on dismantling this great nation. Our guest today is Alabama AG Steve Marshall. We'll unpack all of this and talk about his run for the U.S. Senate in Alabama. General Marshall, welcome to the Terry Schilling Show.
Hey, good to be with you. Thank you.
So, first things first, can we get out of this mess? I mean, it seems very dark in America. The Democrats seem to have a lot of momentum right now. How do we get out of this mess? How do we turn our country around? Do you have hope?
I do have hope. And look, we cannot be so naive to not think that we hadn't been in difficult situations before. You know, one of the things that I drew a parallel in this most recent election to the Reagan-Carter election several years ago, right? I mean, we think about economically where we were as a country, in some ways morally challenged with what was going on in society. And we had that refreshing, optimistic, and visionary voice of Ronald Reagan that was able to transcend all of the negative that was going on and really begin to lead this country on a path moving forward that you and I embrace. I think one of the lessons learned that we had is, as conservatives, we didn't plant the roots deep enough. And it's why we came back to the point where we are today. I mean, because look, if we look back historically and issues that you and I care about, in 1972, when we had Title IX come about, we didn't question who was a boy and who was a girl. You think about the ERA, which, by the way, may have been one of the greater victories I've had as Attorney General, is pushing back against the ERA. Because if we had embodied within the Constitution this language of equality of the sexes, can you imagine how the left would try to weaponize the Constitution in that way? But even then, those that were the strongest proponents of the ERA were never confused about that issue. And so clearly we've had a movement in the wrong direction in our country. But look, I'm encouraged. I think one of the things that has been most exciting about President Trump's reelection is I think there's a new and renewed energy among conservatives, particularly those that care desperately about kind of the fundamental values of what our country was about. If anything, and I tell people this, sounds a little strange, COVID may have been a good thing in some respects because we were opened our eyes about what was going on in our public schools, what was taking place in higher ed, and what's going on with many of the medical organizations or associations, and really gave us an understanding of where we needed to be able to take the fight. And so I'm excited about kind of the direction our country's going. But this is not just a President Trump movement. Mm-hmm. I mean, this has got to be embraced with conservative, strong values being at the forefront, and then allowing multiple warriors to be able to continue that moving forward.
Well, I think what you said earlier about how the victories in the Reagan years weren't as deep-seated as they should have been. That Reagan said that, and he specifically, in his farewell address, he specifically lamented the fact that he didn't think he had done enough to encourage patriotism to be passed on to the next generation, specifically with our schools. And I look at what President Trump's done in just not even the first year, but in the first 10 months while in office. It seems, I mean, he's obviously done a lot. He's done a ton of executive orders. He's really kicked up a hornet's nest. I mean, I think he's the first president in a long time to have reductions in the labor force in the federal government, which we should all be cheering for. But my fear, I think, is if we lose these upcoming midterms and the Democrats start the impeachment thing again, I think Americans rejected Trump in 2020 from a fatigue that was caused by the media of just hearing about scandal after scandal. That's not that they didn't believe it. They just wanted to get back to normalcy, at least like not shrieking. But I'm wondering, are you worried about that as well? Where do you come down on breaking the filibuster?
Yeah, I think if we clearly lose the House or the Senate, then we're going to face some of what we saw before. Now, hopefully there's the ability to push back. But think about what, sort of transparency has revealed for us. The Russia hoax, right? We know that was all a manufactured crisis and clearly trying to attack the efforts of President Trump there. We're now beginning to see even, Arctic frost, I think is what it was called, when we saw Senator Grassley be able to expose, when I saw the organization that I led, the Republican Attorneys General Association, being investigated as part of January 6th as if somehow or another this grand conspiracy that was created by our organization and others, and many that completely have now been deemed to be unfounded. And so I do think that these midterms are critically important, but I also think it is, again, an opportunity for us to be able to share that vision. Parallel with this, I don't think we need to lose sight of this, is we're also coming up on our 250th anniversary. I've been practicing semi-quincentennial, by the way, to be able to say it.
Yeah.
But it is an opportunity in some respects of a fundamental reset of how it is that our young people particularly view our country, view our founders, view the values upon which this country was created. I mean, you have Senator Kaine talking about, our rights come from government. That ought to be a great opportunity for us and push back, and really pleased to see Senator Cruz and others to be able to push back about that fundamentally. But what it shows is the fact that there are so many that do not understand why it is this great experiment began in the first place. And so what I'm hoping is that conservatives and communities embrace this opportunity to really celebrate what this country's about. And I think when we do that, we have the opportunity then to make the argument as Republicans and as conservatives about how our agenda, our values, and our vision is entirely consistent with why this nation was created in the first place.
One thing that bothers me is that, and maybe, look, I'm inundated with news. I'm a well-read person. I've always known who the Vice President of the United States is. I've always known who the Secretary of State is. But I had no clue until I was doing the show prep for this episode that there was a bombing outside your office.
Yeah.
Tell me about that situation. I mean, what do we know? He got 9 years in prison. Is that really is that it?
Yeah, he's got 10 years in another sentence as well. So it's both state and federal charges. But look, my office basically sits under the shadow of the SPLC. So that ought to tell you something right there. But an Antifa following individual who didn't like public officials who were conservative and people of faith. I'm not shocked that we end up having this explosive device set outside our office. And this person, I don't know if they were trying to make a statement or if they were truly trying to cause harm. They were shrapnel that was inside the bomb itself. So it doesn't show me that he was there for peaceful reasons. But it is endemic to the rhetoric and in some ways the justification of the left to not only, call me a racist because I fight redistricting, call me a bigot because we've pushed back against transgender issues, because I follow President Trump, it means I'm a Nazi, or otherwise that we're all fascist. When you look at some of the survey data that's come out post Charlie Kirk's assassination, I mean, it's remarkably troubling. Those that identify on the left will justify not only political violence, but also even can rationalize an assassination of the President of the United States. That's not the conservative movement.
They said the left was saying, why did he have to miss?
Yeah.
Why wasn't he a better shot? Like after President Trump got shot, and then they were gloating and celebrating Charlie getting killed. I guess I support the First Amendment. Obviously I do. I need the First Amendment, especially in the Biden years. But where does the line end? Right? Where is the line when obviously there's tons of violence being committed and instigated really by the left through when they call you a transphobe, when they call you a racist, when they call you all these bad words, they actually are trying to incite violence. Look at Family Research Council. They had the Chick-fil-A shooter here, and that was 10 years ago, I think. where is the line, and how do we start to turn this around where there's actually consequences when you call for someone's death?
Yeah, I think that's kind of the pivot point. And look, and you've talked about it, embrace the value of the First Amendment and what that really means to who we are as a country. We should embrace debate and the opportunity to be able to discuss issues in a very public setting, to be able to help us identify policy and where we need to be able to go. And I'll tell you a little bit of an aside. I think a neat story. Just 2 weeks ago, I was in a setting of conservative students where a young man that was transgender was in the audience. And we got in a back and forth where we talked about our fight around gender affirming care. And he asked legitimate questions for which I was able to give him specific information that he had never heard before, some of which we developed in the lawsuit that you're familiar with in Alabama. And to be able to talk about, a greater risk of suicide for those who transition than those who don't, where we were able to demonstrate what is appropriate to deal with those who are suffering from gender dysphoria, and why testosterone shots in the legs of girls is in fact exactly the opposite. Mm-hmm. Why this isn't medical treatment, but in fact experimentation on kids, because the research doesn't demonstrate that in fact it's something that ought to be used. But in that conversation, we had the opportunity then to talk about my faith. And we had a private conversation afterwards where literally you could see this seed being planted in somebody to truly question about decisions that he had made in his own life and really where he stood. I only say that to be able to say that's the value of the First Amendment, for us to be able to have that free and fair exchange of ideas, even in situations where we disagree. But when that language escalates to threats of violence, then that becomes a very different story. And that's where the criminal laws are able to come in and where we have the opportunity to take action when it's there. But yet our founders firmly believed that we ought to engage in vigorous debate. It's what makes us stronger ultimately to make sure that we have legitimate policies. And as conservatives, we ought to embrace the opportunity. It's one of the wonderful things that we remember about Charlie's life. I mean, I love to just pull up a folding chair behind a table and say, let's talk, and let's have that opportunity to have discussions. But whereas you and I want to debate policy, Democrats want to label and accuse somebody of sinister reasons and sinister beliefs. And that's where I think the difference comes in. And it's hopefully why at some point young people now are beginning to have a very different perspective of what that means, and to embrace this idea that we can celebrate the First Amendment, but we celebrate it for what it was designed to do. And that's for allow us not to be coerced by the government to feel a certain way or believe a certain way, but instead to have open and vigorous debate, but also respect the fact that our neighbors may have a different opinion.
Well, I think one of the terrible costs of all the name calling and the hysteria that is built up from the left using these obviously charged words to call us is it misses the point, right? By calling you and I a bigot, it gets people to stop listening to what we're saying and what we're arguing. Like, I am not against transgender people. I actually think that there are people in this world that suffer from gender confusion and gender dysphoria, but that the answer is not to give a child puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones or surgery. Mm-hmm. It's not even to do that for adults. It's that they need to come to embrace and accept their own body. There's nothing wrong with their body. Their body doesn't need to be changed. Your hormone levels don't need to be changed. What needs to be changed is your mind, right? Your mind is what is the problem here. It's like telling a bulimia victim that, oh no, you really are too skinny, right? You really should throw up your meals afterwards to lose more weight, even though they're 50 pounds underweight. This is a damaging ideology that's actually hurting people. And these girls, right? I read this statistic about, I forget what percentage of these girls that go on the puberty blockers and have their estrogen deprived, they end up developing early onset osteoporosis. They have to walk with canes in their 20s. No one talks about that,
no.
Right? But there's real damage being done to these people. And the motivating factor for, I think, you and I is we want what's best for everyone. And we don't want, just because you say you want something or think you want something, it doesn't mean that that's what's best for you. That, I think, is a major difference between the left and the right today.
Yeah, and what we see is the left wants to suppress facts.
Yes.
I'm an old prosecutor, so I used to tell juries all the time that facts are stubborn things. But let's use the gender affirming care fight as an example of what I'm talking about. One of the things that we were able to get into the underbelly of WPATH to be able to get their records, to get videos.
They hated that, by the way.
Oh, I mean, they fought us tooth and nail. I mean, absolutely tooth and nail. And I know why now, when we were able to see it. But like, for example, one of the fundamental premise of medical care is informed consent. And so that you want doctors to be able to fully advise you on what are the risks, what are the potential consequences as a result of what's going on. For example, those health problems that you described if somebody goes into it. And when we were able to get into those videos and those records, what we found is those doctors who were developing so-called standards of care acknowledged very transparently within their own little group, we don't know how to explain this to anybody. We don't know how to explain the risk. We don't know that anybody can truly understand if, in fact, we engage in this treatment for X period of time, what are the adverse medical consequences that could take place. But maybe even more alarming was the fact that if you're that parent of that kid who's struggling, how are you going to feel not only in knowing doctors can't explain to you the risk, that you found out that you were lied to because they told you information that wasn't true, suicide risk being one of them. And that's what I heard from parents all along. What am I going to do? You know, if they tell me my child's going to commit suicide if I don't allow this to take place, so I've got to be able to support it. But also when we found lawyers for the left that had their own political agenda, being able to write to the medical organization to say, hey, we need you to change your language. We need to change that standard because if you say it this way, you're going to impact our ability to go after states that otherwise want to protect kids from this problem. And then the worst of all was, you know, that email that we found from Rachel Levine when Rachel Levine writes to WPATH to be able to say, even though you were, I mean, I don't even want to acknowledge this is a good thing, but yet it was, at least they were putting age restrictions on surgeries. But you need to take that out because you're impacting our ability to push a transgender political agenda. I mean, holy cow. Yeah. And at least our ability through litigation to expose that now I think has been transformative in what we've been able to do in this movement. And thank you, by the way, for your fight and for your advocacy. Because as you well know, it seemed like we were a little bit voices in the wilderness and nobody was hearing us because we had all of this work against us. But then I say all that story is because I've sat with detransitioners, done panels with Chloe, for example, and you hear them talk about, here's my life now. And while I'm glad to be back, glad that I have addressed the issues that I was dealing with, as a result of gender affirming care, this is what my life looks like. This is what my health is like now. And this is the consequences of what those doctors have done to me. And so it's why I look forward to their medical malpractice cases moving forward and the opportunity to present their individual claims. But it is representative of the need and the reasons for us to continue to be active and continue to fight.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate because I do think the momentum's completely shifted on the trans fight and the fight against what the industry was doing. $4.5 billion annually, by the way. It's growing every year, but it's shifted. But it really was dangerous to talk about. I mean, people, the media would come after you. The special interests would spend tons of money against you. I felt definitely like a voice in the wilderness during that. But I'm really puzzled. I'd like you to explain it because you've been a huge champion for protecting children and parents, by the way, from this nonsense. What made you get involved in that fight? Because I do want to get to your U.S. Senate race because I do think you'd be a fantastic senator and would be an incredible addition there. But what made you step into the breach in protecting children? Because it's not like there's a ton of money on our side on this. What was it?
Yeah. So Alabama was the third state to be able to pass the law. And if I told you that I even had heard of gender affirming care much before that, I'd be lying because it was not in my vernacular. And by the way, I had no idea that it was taking place in Birmingham. But there were two moments for me. One is when we passed the law and we initially did the hearing to try to stop the law from being enjoined, where the left had sued us, including the Biden administration sued us. And, you hear parents who are very passionate about kind of protecting their kids and what they were told if they don't do it. You hear medical professionals come in and just say, oh, this is the standard of care. This is generally accepted across not only the United States, but across the world as the way to deal with those kids that are suffering from gender dysphoria. And then you see conservative judges who fundamentally have a sense of parental rights and the ability to dictate care for your kids. And it was like, this doesn't make sense because we were beginning to hear the rumblings of Europe. We were understanding as we were able to get a little bit of time because all this happened in a very truncated way, beginning to hear the effort of the left to have penetrated the medical organizations, to penetrated part of large law firms that want to do pro bono work, to be able to somehow or another show to their woke corporate clients that we are part of your effort to do it. And then we at least heard from some really good researchers and advocates in our space, many of which you would know, that were just telling us a very different story. And we just thought from Alabama's perspective that we want to find out because we saw several states lose the injunction and just kind of say, I just don't think this is a fight we can win. And we said that we were willing to do it and willing to break the resources. And then the other thing, and this is a little bit personal, when we heard one of the doctors at UAB, which is the institution in Alabama that was doing it, who was the strong advocate for this clinic, and she was in a speech talking about one of her patients who committed suicide and was trying to use that aggressively to be able to say what an honorable and bold statement for this child about where their life is. And my late wife died from suicide. And I thought, how in the world can somebody use suicide as the vehicle to advance this issue that's going on with kids? And so to say that lit a little bit of a spark in me too would be an understatement. And we just made the decision that we're going to put together the team and we were going to fight this until we were able to truly find out what was going on. And, not only was it important for us to figure out what was driving this huge spike in kids that were identifying as transgender, because clearly we just had no research basis to begin to show what that was going on. And I think we're beginning now to learn kind of where that was coming from. And also the good thing is seeing that huge spike has now had a significant precipitous drop. But we also wanted to figure out what that, and I'm going to call it a conspiracy because I think that's exactly what it was. What was the conspiracy between doctors, lawyers, and politicians that was driving what was clearly not at all, not even a conservative movement, but a mainstream movement, right? I mean, just good old-fashioned folks who don't care much about politics, that just want to live good lives and live with their family. Even they were going, this doesn't make sense. And then kind of the final straw for me was, I don't even know where it is I saw it, but it was a gender reveal party with a video for a 4-year-old. Yeah. And I was like, this is dark. No way. And so, look, it's been a unique period. One of the greatest honors I've gotten was Leo Sapir saying that, the worst mistake of the Biden administration's DOJ was suing Alabama over that law, in the space. And I was like,
you knew what you were talking about.
Yeah. And so that was, huge for us to be able to do it. And what I'm excited about is because of your work, because of the work of AGs and lawyers across the country, we've exposed it for what it is. And I think we are saving lives, we're saving kids. And not only did we have the opportunity to do it here in the United States, but to be able to support people like Hillary Cass, who was very clear in being able to talk about the lack of evidence-based research to support what others were doing. And I do think it's one of those issues in which we have transformed not only the narrative, but the practice. And as a result of that, people are better off.
Well, first, I want to thank you for opening up about your wife. I had read that and I was not going to bring it up because I know how devastating suicide is for everyone. I have friends that have lost family members to that. But I do want to really emphasize just how evil it is. I mean, I can't imagine losing a spouse to that. But what these counselors, what this industry does is they tell parents that if you don't do this to your child, you're at risk of losing them to suicide. I mean, I can't think of anything more nefarious, anything more evil, and really honestly could be the only possible justification for actually sterilizing and mutilating a child is to prevent something like that. And that's the whole impetus behind the left saying that this is life-saving treatment. It's obviously not true, but it was not beyond them to lie.
This idea of being trapped in a body, was clearly the narrative that they were advancing. But one of the things, and I don't know whether or not this has always struck you, but it has for me, is the unique coalition that came together around this. Because yes, were there conservatives like you and I that were pushing against this? Yeah. But we had this passionate and advocate group of the gay and lesbian community that likewise came forward to be able to say, what you're doing to kids is wrong. And so, when I talked about sort of this is in the sense of not a red-blue issue per se, is when do you see that coalition come together around issues of public policy? Not all the time. And so the fact that the gay and lesbian community saw the value in the fight that we were fighting, I think demonstrates not only the harm they perceived that was going on with kids, but how absolutely wayward the transgender movement had become.
And just how insane the whole concept is. I mean, we've always had cross-dressers. We've always had, people that, didn't feel comfortable in their own bodies. But this was the first time that, I shouldn't say that actually, because we've had eunuchs throughout history, but they went with a new name this time, right? They went with something that if they had started off this movement with eunuchs as the brand, it would have failed immediately. It wouldn't even have gone off the ground. But they had to invent a whole new vocabulary, a whole new system of pronouns to push it. And I'm just glad that we've had warriors like you there in office with power who are willing to use it, right? I think that so many times we see people get elected to power and they say, "Oh, I don't want to do this," or I don't think this is a role for government," whatever. And there are legitimate times where that's fair to claim, but I think in terms of protecting children from an industry that's going to make money off of them by sterilizing and mutilating them, I don't think there's any better use of government than to protect children from that.
Right. One thing I'll tell you, so we had to go to our legislature and ask for additional dollars for us, because when you have well-funded groups from the left plus the Biden administration coming after you, it's an army against a small team. And look, I had a small group, and by the way, remarkable. Now my Solicitor General Barrett Bowdry kind of led our team for Alabama, and he's been amazing. But had to go and ask for, I think it was $500,000 to be able to put in a contract for lawyers to come help us, and that's not an easy thing to do. Significant tax dollars. It's the people of Alabama basically funding this national fight. And so I wondered how it'd be received. And I was literally in the grocery store not long after the story came out that the Attorney General was seeking the money. This woman stopped me and she said, "Saw the story about you getting money for lawyers." And I was like, "Yes, ma'am. Yeah, we did." And she said, "You need to get more if it takes that to be able to protect our kids." And that was a moment for me that I knew we had also hit the chord with people in our state, is that they saw this wasn't a waste of money. And sometimes, for example, although we're defending an Alabama law, we were taking on the issue nationally. It's like, why do you care what goes on outside of the boundaries of Alabama? Well, this is one of those times and one of those moments where people understood why it is that we do that. Not just, helping Jack Phillips in Colorado or Belnell Stutzman out in the state of Washington or Coach Kennedy, right? I mean, people begin to see those. But taking on this fight that was beyond our border was something that I think was important to the people I represent. And candidly, it's one of the reasons why being the Attorney General of Alabama is such a liberating thing, is because the people of my state have given me the liberty to fight battles that maybe other people can't or won't. And so it's a unique opportunity when you're saying, I'm going to raise my hand and I'm going to step up and I'm willing to take the arrows when they come, that it's worth it, because you can achieve really, really good things.
Well, okay. You're the Attorney General of Alabama right now, and everyone I've ever met from Alabama just absolutely loves it. Anyone I've hired from Alabama ends up moving right back to Alabama very quickly. I am wondering, why the U.S. Senate? What do you want to do there? Why leave Alabama and go to Washington, D.C. to take on all these scumbags?
Yeah, I tell people I'm deployed to Montgomery. I also would tell people I'd be deployed to D.C. It will not be permanent home. But, we need conservative warriors, and we have to have people that are prepared to fight. Eric Schmidt's a dear friend of mine, senator from Missouri. I served as AGs together before he came. And we had a good conversation when this became an opportunity simply because Coach Tuberville decided to go back home to Alabama. Because, truth be told, I was done. I didn't want to run for governor. I didn't want to do anything else. And so we're trying to figure out where's my place next and try to be obedient to where God led. But when Coach decided to come home, it really opened the door to see whether or not this made sense. And talked to Eric about, because he and I are very much aligned on issues, how did your work as AG translate to being a United States Senator? Because look, it's a different branch of government, right? Very different role. And he said, you've dealt with the issues before, across a variety of areas. You're exposed to the things that you have to deal with in the United States Senate, and it's very much something that you can take what you were passionate about at home and try to do something while you're here. And I think that was a significant motivator for me because, while in some respects we've made tremendous progress, we do not have final victory on a variety of areas. I mean, even right now, we ought to continue. Coach Tuberville right now has advanced the bill that we need to get across the finish line. So once and for all, we're not fighting this battle of left versus right or in the Supreme Court over boys playing in sports against girls, right? That we can finally get that issue resolved by making a very clear change to Title IX so that we're not having this sort of battle by litigation between administrations, and that we can have the opportunity through a legitimate exercise of congressional authority to be able to change the law in that area. And so, some of the things that we've been working on for quite some time, where maybe it was the finger in the dike, is let's find ways that we can legislate around those issues that matter, not only people in Alabama, but also conservatives across the country. And look, I recognize the Senate's a different creature. Right now, as you got a referenced earlier, taking 60 to get across the finish line on certain policy matters. It's one reason why midterms matter, right? Is that kind of where we stand with numbers across the board. But you still got to have a champion. You've got to have somebody that's willing to take on those issues, be the voice, and try to develop the coalition that can ultimately get to where you're accomplishing good things. And so it's the one thing that's kind of unique about my background. Prosecutors, remarkable blessing for me to be able to work with victims and with law enforcement. But prosecutors learn to do two things. One is to be those powerful advocates in a courtroom in front of a jury and persuade them to what it is that we believe we want them to do. But you also have to be able to work and solve problems because you have monumentally far more cases than you can ever address. And so you got to figure out, how do I come to resolution that makes sense and satisfies those that are around? And so that skill set, I think, is really vital ultimately in coming into a setting like the United States Senate. Is I know the things I care desperately about. I know the opportunity of when you just got to draw the line in the sand and fight the fight, but also understand there are other issues that you can work to build a coalition to try to help accomplish what you want to accomplish. And we talked a little bit earlier, the issue of girls sports is an 80-20 issue when you poll the public. Issue. And we should be able to get to a coalition. The Dems have to not be afraid to do the right thing. Look, when Gavin Newsom is saying we think this ought to be something that's okay, then that ought to tell you that somebody that clearly puts their finger in the air to figure out which way the wind's blowing. And then we take on those battles that we know that we have the opportunity to be able to fight. And then the other is sometimes you got to have a person that's willing to stand up, and maybe others aren't, to stop bad things from happening. Mm-hmm. And so want to make sure that we have the opportunity to do that as well.
Let's talk about the Senate shutdown. Obviously, Democrats were the reason this shutdown happened. Have you seen anything in Alabama? Any crazy flight delays? And how's the shutdown impacted you guys down there?
Yeah, a couple of ways. One, I have a son-in-law that's an air traffic controller. Mm-hmm. So, he's
a stressful job, by the way. And then they have to worry about a paycheck.
Well, and then they've had people that are not showing up for work because, objecting to what's going on. But what have the Dems accomplished through this, right? They want to have a discussion about ACA subsidies. Senator Thune said, you can have that vote if you want it. Said that before they ever took the shutdown. They were able to restore layoffs of federal workers. We wouldn't have had the layoffs, but for the shutdown itself. And so all we've done is take, a month and a half for the Dems to fight back Chuck Schumer fighting back against AOC and others for his own political survival, and for them somehow or another trying to show that they were tough. Well, I don't think that's gone anywhere. And what I found is when I was leaving to come up here, there was a church that does food giveaways, groceries for local community, and the line was twice as long as it normally is because of folks that were trying to make sure that they had the ability to feed their families. We had obviously our military who were beginning to get paid, but no assurance that they were going to be able to get their next paycheck. And then others that, weren't able to provide benefits to VA, our veterans and others through the VA that otherwise they wanted to be able to get. And so I think what we heard was just a great deal of frustration and directed at the Democrats and not the Republicans, because everybody all along, and like you heard Chuck Schumer when he's on the other side say that any party that tries to shut down the government is being irresponsible. Well, you got to be consistent with your arguments if you truly believe something foundationally.
Unless the media is fully in the tank for you.
There you go, which has
away with it.
Been the truth for a while. And so this was all a show, and it was the show at the expense of the American people and many folks who are dedicated to working to serving the people of our country.
Well, obviously, at the heart of this has been the ACA subsidies, or at least that's what Democrats claim they were. And what Democrats have proposed is a 1-year clean extension of the subsidies. There's a solid group of Republicans in both the House and the Senate that are concerned about how these subsidies will actually fund health insurance plans that cover gender transitions for minors even, and abortions. What's your take on that? Should there be a clean CR extended for a year, or do you think the Republicans should fight to keep these subsidies, limited to not funding those types of things?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things in play here. Number one, these subsidies really came about during COVID, and so you have to legitimately ask the question of if there's been an increase in cost that's taken place since then. What's the rationale and the reason behind that? I think you've seen a pretty vigorous attack by Republicans against insurance companies and kind of what that's meant. I think fundamentally, we shouldn't be having taxpayer dollars subsidize gender-specific treatments that otherwise don't need medical care or otherwise subsidizing abortion.
At this point, insurance premiums are essentially a tax, right? Because everyone's paying it. Everyone's premiums covering the other people's coverage. So by mandating that these policies are covered, kind of forcing the rest of us to pay for it. Why can't you pay for your own sex change procedure?
Yeah, and no different than kind of what we saw with the Hyde Amendment, trying to keep federal dollars from going toward abortion. We all ought to advocate for that same thing. But look, I think we also have to acknowledge as Republicans, we really had very limited and had no Republican support for the subsidies themselves. But for, I guess, John McCain, we wouldn't have had Obamacare to begin with. We thought, by the way, as Republican AGs, we had a couple of lawsuits that would have been able to reverse the actions of Congress. Chief Justice Roberts became the swing vote in those, and I wish we'd have been successful. And I think even the Democrats have to acknowledge that there is waste and abuse within that system that needs to be corrected. And so just to pour money at subsidies to somehow or another think that's the singular solution to a problem, I think is wrong. I think if the Democrats want to open up that discussion of subsidies, then we also have to open up the discussion about the program itself, including removing things like you talked about from being eligible and it being covered, and then also determining who really should be receiving the subsidies, if at all, and what those income levels are for folks that receive them.
I've read stories that show that or make the case that there are people that are making well into the six figures that are getting subsidies. I don't think that's what those subsidies are meant to be subsidizing.
No, it wasn't designed that way at all. And then, look, we've seen what happens when government fosters dependence. We've seen it with regard to our labor participation rates for those that view it's a whole lot cheaper for me just to not work than to work. And otherwise, that when we give government the authority to dictate winners and losers, then typically society is the ultimate loser.
Yes. I want to unpack abortion a little bit because this is an issue that you have not shied away from at all. But, when Dobbs was decided, first of all, I don't think people realize that abortions, since we've overturned Roe, are up nationwide by 10%. Mm-hmm. There are actually more abortions today than before. we overturn Roe. That's very interesting. But one thing that I think is to blame, I think that several other experts are saying is to blame, are these Blue Shield laws in states like California and Washington and Minnesota and New York and Illinois. And what these laws do, just for the audience members that might not be familiar, these Blue Shield laws allow for doctors in blue states like Massachusetts to do a teleconference or telehealth meeting with someone in Texas, a state where abortion is restricted, abortion drugs are restricted, where transgender drugs for children are restricted. It allows them to mail those drugs into Texas, into these red states that have protected people from these procedures without any legal recourse, without the ability to sue for medical malpractice. Kathy Hochul, just a few months ago, said that she was never going to enforce Texas's laws, that Texas would need to figure that out on their own. How do we stop these Blue Shield laws, and what would you do at the federal level to stop it?
I'm going to back you up one level. I think we can get assistance from the FDA, number one, with mifepristone and going back to what is the appropriate protocol for the dispensing of mifepristone that existed prior to the Obama administration. Ryan Anderson has done a great study that's been out there talking about the understated health risk for...
It's a very dangerous drug.
For women, yes. And so if we can get those old standards, which included, by the way, an in-person visit with a doctor, the dispensing that takes place in the clinic, then what we avoid, and by the way, I'm not advocating we want to be able to do that generally because, again, it's an abortion. But what it avoids is that doctor from a blue state using telehealth as a way of being able to get those drugs into our states. And so if we can resolve that on the front end, then I think we make progress. And then beyond that, the Congress needs to supersede the Shield laws and simply say that basically they violate full faith and credit, and we don't need to allow those to take place. So that, for example, the criminal warrant that's been issued out of the state of Louisiana can be executed in the state of New York so that that person can be prosecuted for the civil judgment in the state of Texas right now against another physician in the state of New York can be served, and that judgment can be collected upon. That when you somehow or another give blue states the ability to create a safe haven for bad behavior, that's not at all what our laws were designed to be able to do. And so I think the only vehicle in which we're going to be successful is for Congress to be able to act. And that would be something that would be a priority for me if I had the opportunity to be in the Senate.
Well, one thing that I viewed as very disappointing is that a lot of the Republicans who didn't want to continue talking about this issue have either supported the expansion of this to the states, and then they say it's states' rights. We're going to leave it to the states, but then they don't do anything when California is mailing drugs into red states that are prescribed. I mean, it essentially means that California's abortion laws, California's transgender laws are now nationwide. Mm-hmm. And that's why I've always been skeptical about this state or these policies remaining only at the state level, is because at a certain point, push is going to come to shove, and it's either going to be California setting the laws for the whole country or America and setting the laws for the whole country.
Yeah, I mean, it's literally that federalism debate that's sort of at the core of the 10th Amendment. And we see that, too, outside of just the issue you've described. You've got, for example, these blue states that have adopted something called Superfund laws that allow them to tax energy companies and others outside of their own state for their so-called climate change damages. And so to the extent that we want California and other blue states to become the great regulator, then I think that we have to push back in the areas in which they are attempting to do that. We've seen it, and we're suing around those Superfund sites, but it's why these Shield laws likewise have to be within the gamut of where it is we're opposing. There's always going to be the litigation back and forth, but until we have Congress fully act, I don't know that we're ever going to solve that issue wholly. I want
to open it to you in a sec, but I for what you want, what else? I've kind of been directing the conversation. You've been fantastic, but we just had these elections in Virginia and New Jersey, and obviously New York, and they didn't work out that well for us. I think, one thing that I think Republicans really have to figure out is how to address the affordability crisis for young Americans. We can't afford homes. We were told we have to go to college, get a 4-year degree just to get a good job. The problem is you end up with a mortgage worth of debt when you get out, and you can't find a job that pays for that. What's Senator Steve Marshall going to do to address the affordability crisis?
Yeah, this is the impact of Biden inflation, right? In the sense of what we saw uniquely. I was saw an advertisement for a new truck that was more than the first house that I ever bought. I don't want to say how long ago that was, but it's there. But no, I think that is a legitimate question for many Americans. Is that you had many that were sort of sold a bill of goods relating to higher education. They obviously accumulated significant student debt, and then suddenly the job prospects didn't materialize in a way that they weren't able to deal with that debt quickly enough. And so I think there's been a cascading effect of problems that's kind of led us to this point. But I think we also can't lose sight of the fact that, let's say in new home costs, for example, I think it's roughly 30 to 35% of the cost of a new home is just compliance with regulations of local, state, and at federal level. And so one of the things that has been sort of very much a key part of what I've done as Attorney General is to really push back against the overregulation of the federal government particularly, and to try to allow for market forces to be able to control regulating areas in which it makes sense, but also not to the point that, for example, we had the federal government back in dealing with the gender effort of the Biden administration want to use OSHA to require employers to use preferred pronouns of their employees, or somebody use their own bathroom. I mean, again, that's not a place where the federal government needs to be. And so we have to find opportunities to be able to remove that. I think the president right now is working hard to bring manufacturing back to our state to be able to deal with having more rational trade deals with our trading partners, and understanding that many of the materials that are used, particularly on the housing side, are coming from foreign countries, and we need to make sure that we're doing that here in our country. And then I think we got to make sure that we are allowing kids to understand the opportunities that exist separate and apart from a 4-year degree to be able to get into well-paying, good jobs for them and their families. And I think workforce development is critically important and would be another area that I'd want to focus upon.
Yeah, when I think about this issue, like I think about my own kids, and if my son came to me and said, "Hey Dad, I've been thinking about this. I don't want to go to college or get a degree. I kind of want to be an electrician." I would be over the moon thrilled and happy. One, I got now an electrician in the family. I can save money on bills, but I know he's going to make money. He's not going to have a ton of debt. He'll be able to provide for his family, because we're always going to need electricians. No robot's going to be able to fix electrical problems.
No, and isn't it interesting how with AI and how it's kind of developing, it's really, in some ways removing kind of that middle management area in much of kind of white collar America, and I think when I need that plumber, when I need that electrician, when I need that mechanic, when I need those with the ability to weld. I mean, just those specific skills that help make our country what it is today. We have an opportunity to be able to make sure that we're speaking specifically not only about what that means long term for somebody, but kind of what that skill set makes you as marketable across county lines, state lines, and where it is you may want to raise your family.
All right. Well, I'm gonna put you on the spot, right? I appreciate you.
You haven't already? No.
Well, no, I kind of have, but I appreciate you humoring me and talking about all the issues, that I'm interested in. But you're running for U.S. Senate. Obviously, you're interested in that job. I think that's a major reason why you're on the show today. Make your pitch.
I think what Alabama has seen from me is a guy that's not only been willing to take on the tough issues, been able to deliver the results. And that's been from the issues that we had relating to gender affirming care, the fights that we've had on kind of girls' sports and girls' locker rooms. But it's also been standing up around ESG and DEI, saying the things that others wouldn't say because we knew it was the right thing to be able to do. And so I think what people can expect from me in the United States Senate is to have a champion who's willing to be a warrior for conservative causes and to be able to stand up on those principles that I think are fundamental to who we are as a state in Alabama that matter to people across our country. And so excited about the opportunity to be that advocate and to be that voice, but also somebody that has the opportunity to be able to deliver the results.
Honestly, I think that's a great pitch. And I do campaigns. That's like my background. But you look at the problems that we're suffering from as a nation and really like what the problem is in Congress is that there's no courage. There's no backbones. There's just caving. There is paying your friends off and not standing up for the people that you're representing, right? And so I'm so glad you're in the race. I think you're going to make a fantastic senator.
Thank you.
I know the DC is going to be a lot better off having you here, but even more importantly, Alabama is going to be much better off having you here representing them. Where can people find you, and how do they, find out more about your campaign?
Yeah, SteveMarshallForSenate.com is where folks can go to our website, find out a little bit more information about us. We're out, on all forms of social media that talk about where we are across our state, and particularly highlighting the issues that we think are important.
Very good. Well, General Marshall, thank you so much for joining us today, and hopefully we can have you back once you're sworn in as the next U.S. Senator from Alabama.
Be my honor. Thank you.
Thank you.